Hi, this is Eric Bryant, and I'm excited today to spend some time with Gerardo Marti. Welcome, Gerardo. How are you?
Real good, Eric.
Excellent. So I guess I always forget to call you Dr. Marti. You've had this PhD for a while from University of Southern California. You got your bachelor's from Pepperdine. Maybe for those who haven't had a chance to watch one of these interviews or hear you speak at a conference, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I'm a sociologist trained at the University of Southern California, and I started teaching college classes a long, long time ago. And when I finally completed my PhD, I made the move into being a full-time professor and researcher. So I spend my time between teaching my courses, I chair my department, but I also spend a tremendous amount of time out, as we say, in the field, across the country, sometimes in other countries as well, and interacting with other scholars, leading scholars of religion and race and culture, particularly in the world, and spend as much of my time trying to coordinate that work, speaking, consulting, and then writing those things that I've come to learn.
Well, and I love you always challenge me and all of us really because you are doing research and kind of people seem to move on so quickly. And what's the next thing? What's the next thing? And the way that you work as a sociologist and researcher and author feels like you're trying to get to the bottom of things because you're looking at trends that last longer than just 15 minutes. And obviously, Mosaic of Believers, Hollywood Faith, those are a couple of your books. Worship Across the Racial Divide. You're looking at things that are really meaningful, really spiritual. Like you said, it's dealing with race and culture. I'll put up on the screen here in a little bit some websites so that people can go and spend more time seeing what you've written and learning more about what you do. But in general, what led you to this new book, The Deconstructed Church, or is it Deconstructing Church?
The Deconstructed Church.
Ah, excellent.
Right there.
Tell us the next step in your, there it is, thank you. The next step for you in this research, and you were co-author in this book, maybe share with us a little bit about what you're finding that people may have already assumed, they already know all about this, but you're finding things that people don't necessarily know.
Yeah. Well, I'm really fascinated with religion and social change, and I've found that congregations are really strategic ways of understanding the way in which changes are happening in our society. These are things that are not flash in the pan. These are things that have been going on for a long, long time. And so I'd made a trip in 2010 to Belfast to visit a conference created by Peter Rollins of Icon, and many people know Pete Rollins. He's made a number of appearances in the United States and now lives in the United States and has written a number of books. But Pete and the number of people that he put together in that particular meeting really resonated with me in tapping into the fundamental issues of what's going on in what a lot of people call the emerging church movement. Now, I've been connected to the emerging church movement relationally for many, many years. Since the mid-1990s, even before it had a name and people really knew what was going on. But this thing has continued to gain steam. There's a lot of books written, a lot of blog posts out there, and there are people who love it and there are people who really hate it. There are people who believe that they're already experts on whatever this thing is, but I found that there is a lot that we are still discovering about what does it really mean to have these churches that are in many ways anti-Christian, or at least anti-Christianity, but still want to keep Jesus. They want to walk away from their churches, and yet they still come together in gatherings that are very church-like in a lot of ways. And there are people who reject much of theology, Orthodox theology as we've gained it, but are trying to recreate and remaster different types of beliefs about what we should know about God, the world, and ourselves using more contemporary philosophical systems. And so Out of spending a tremendous amount of time in these meetings, at conferences, working with data from focus groups where people are talking from within these churches, I spent a lot of time really listening to what these people are saying, and then as a sociologist connecting it to the world as it is changing.
One of the things, excuse me, one of the things I wanted to hear you share about is in this idea of deconstructing church, there seems to be obviously a response to the current church, and there's this great quote by Derrida.
Right, Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher.
Yes, in your introduction that talks about how the church just continues to exist and thrive because we continue to deconstruct and kind of resurrect almost in every generation. So there's something healthy and good about this. But do you find that are these churches, and maybe this is just a part of it, but are these churches reaching new people not being reached by the church that they came from? Or are they just more a new way to do church for the people who grew up not liking what they grew up in? Or do you see a little bit of both?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you phrase it, because even in the phrasing, you say reaching people. And that reaching sort of betrays your own background. It says that for you, church should be about evangelism and outreach and bringing in people who are not connected. And there's something fundamental about these type of churches that even react to that kind of language. Now, I call them congregations because they are groups of people who gather together to affirm, even if it's an ambiguous and uncertain religious orientation, but it is not something that is oriented around reaching people. And they would really react to the statement that it's about reaching people. If anything, it's about people who consider themselves refugees from the sort of mainstream church as we know it, both in the main line as well as in the sort of evangelical megachurch models. And so what we do find is that for many people, they say this is the last stop they had before leaving church altogether. And so an outsider might call it rescue, but they don't see it as a rescue. They see it as, they've really been not just turned off, but have been hurt, feel angry, sometimes outright disgusted with what they've understood to be church in their experience in the past. But they still find a value to trying to get in touch with God, to have an individual connection and experience with God, and to try to explore that with other people. It's just that these groups are very open to doubt, to what many people would call heresy, that there's the morality that may be involved is not the same, and so there's not an expectation that people live up to certain standards in their personal lives in a particular way. And so all these people are sort of coming out of what they see as very constraining religious systems that for them was not connected to true religion. That whatever it was that God and Christ would have us be and do in this world, those churches don't represent it. And trying to really get our minds around what this thing is, especially if you're rooted in a particular ecclesiology. I mean, if you have a really strong sense of what the church should be, this book will be challenging for you, because the book will not try to argue for it, but it will try to explain it. And by explaining it, you come to understand a very different way of how to do church, if you're willing to have that kind of an ear, if you're willing to learn.
Yeah, well, and that kind of leads to my next question. I mean, for those who are watching this, if they found it through my website, they may be more on the kind of like a Mosaic or a Gateway here in Austin, where I'm a part of.
Mm-hmm.
Their desire to be kind of a church for people who are disconnected. They're interested in God. They're interested in spirituality, and we find Jesus as the one we follow and want them to follow. And there's also some folks that maybe are from a more traditional context, more of a denominational context. For these, like in Belfast that you described, kind of the refugees from the evangelical church, so to speak, what can both the traditional church, those who are um, kind of see things from a more reaching the world, changing lives kind of perspective, what are some of the things that all these different tribes can learn from these other folks that are kind of the refugees?
Yeah. Well, I think you make a great point, Eric. I think that my first book, Mosaic of Believers, is definitely one that people in your network would enjoy and appreciate. It will affirm and expand their understanding of things that they maybe have not had time to think about. The Hollywood Faith book about Oasis will also be very affirming and challenge maybe some things, but it will really speak to a type of church that many people will already recognize and say that this is a legitimate work of God in the world today. The Worship Across the Racial Divide book, I think also many people in your network will really resonate with because of their desperate desire to see racial and ethnic diversity happen in their congregations, to really see multiple colors, multiple ancestral backgrounds, multiple languages in the same fellowship. I think that book really speaks to that in a very pointed way. But I would say as a further through point from those works, looking at social change, look at how culture is working so that religion accommodates in many ways to the changes that are happening in our society. I think that this book is going to be the most challenging for that audience, because this book goes deeper than my previous books in trying to understand what the nature of our society is today. It goes deeper in understanding the alternative religious orientations that are emerging because of the change in our structure, because of the change in structures of society today. And in some ways, it helps us to understand our own churches, because these principles are embedded deeply in the churches that we're very excited about, but it takes a different manifestation. And so one of the things that's really prized by these congregations is religious freedom. And religious freedom, though, doesn't mean the church on the corner is doing one thing, the mosque over in the other neighborhood is doing something else. It's about preserving religious freedom within a congregation, within the same congregation. And one of the things that these people treasure and emphasize is that each person has their own right to discern what their religiosity should be, and that they create liturgies, worship services, activities within their churches that allow people to express their own connection to God in multiple ways. And those multiple ways allow people to say, look, this is how I'm responding to myself, to my relationship to the world and to God right now. Now, it may be different next week, it could be different next year, but this is what I'm doing right now. And there's a real opening to questioning, to really interrogating in a very deep way. And that sense of incredible openness within a congregation, I think that most mainstream congregations would find very threatening and very dangerous. Well, these people embrace that not as dangerous, but as valuable. They embrace the diversity as an inherent part of the world, and they allow that diversity to happen within their own churches. And I think that there's something about that sense of safety and that deep appreciation for hospitality, for care, for allowing the stranger, and to allow the stranger a place and a voice that is definitely valued, not just by, it's so nice that they're here. It's like, it's so nice we have guests. No, it's that they themselves, who consider themselves to be deeply committed to these gatherings, will themselves say, look, I really don't know. I have a lot of questions. Or I definitely am not that. And so there's a contention that they allow within these churches. And I think that deep sense of being willing to rethink is something that in and of itself is innovative. And casual conversations even with people in my neighborhood, on an airplane across the world, there are many people who are not committed to our very cool evangelical churches who say that type of religious gathering speaks to them, that's the way it should work. So,
Yeah, no, and I think that's what's interesting too about, what you do. I mean, you're kind of looking at how and why and social trends and things like that, and it's interesting because one of the things that's always been important to me when whether I was in Los Angeles or in Austin, was acknowledging that every kind of expression of the church needs to better represent where it is. And
hmm,
so a church in Austin should look different than a church in Belfast and look different than a church in Oklahoma City.
hmm.
And yet sometimes we try to impose what we do is the way on everyone else.
Hmm.
And what you always do, Gerardo, and I think this book is another great example of that, is really stretch us to consider, are we doing what we're doing because it's best for us,
Hmm.
and we like it, or is it what we're supposed to be doing? And so
Yeah,
I
well,
really appreciate that about
well, I
what you.
think that it's fascinating how you talk about that, because I do think that those local manifestations are important. At the same time, I do think that when we look at video from Mosaic in LA, and then we look at Hillsong in New York City, and I suspect that maybe even if I took a video of your own church, you would see radical similarities in how church has been institutionalized for this particular way of being church, right? And so there's a sense in which you could say, well, we should emphasize certain things here in Austin, but that model of what you're doing in Austin is likely to be found in St. Louis, and in Omaha, and in Seattle, and in any number of places. And the thing about this particular book, and in looking at what's going on here, particularly in chapter 3, where I'm talking through people's stories about how they understand their own religious life and their own sense of what it means to be Christian and how they relate to church, or the last chapter, which is a very grand tour of saying, what are the main and characteristics of religion today, and how does that tap into the deepest structures of our society that are likely to last for not just a decade but hundreds of years. We're looking at something that is similar also, and you will find these gatherings, these non-traditional alternative gatherings happening in urban settings and in rurals, and in the big mega places, as well as that are by airports and things, and places that are a bit further off. This style of gathering is just as ubiquitous as the contemporary Christian stage and lights, preacher wearing a T-shirt, kind of churches that many of our evangelical churches have now. And that's what I'm trying to tap into. Well, I'm trying to tap into something that's so important and so significant that you don't have to go very far to find it. Now, you may not have noticed it, but it's there. And that's what I think we're trying to get at, is a style that people find meaningful for themselves about how to do religion. And its main counterpoint is everything that we think we know about Christianity. And whatever we think we know about Christianity, they don't want any part of it, and are creating something radically different. I think that's it's remarkable, and I'm still thinking about it. I'm still fascinated, but I guarantee you that it's not something that's a flash in the pan. It's something that's going to be around for a very long time.
Well, I do think the word deconstructed is a great word to describe what you're talking about, and it is interesting because every generation, if we just keep doing it the way we did it, like Mosaic in the '90s, or if we keep doing it the way Gateway's always done it, we're going to become that institution. And I do think that Sunday mornings are interesting because what was radical and revolutionary when you and I, in the '90s were at Mosaic, is now becoming commonplace. And,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly Sundays is just one part of what happens. It's not only who else is there, but what else is happening throughout the week, and
Yeah.
even values and what people understand themselves to be that can make some of these churches that might look on the surface the same but can be different. But I think maybe one of the things I hear you saying is who's on stage, or maybe that's not the right word, but who leads in the deconstructed church that you're describing. it sounds like you don't have to believe to be a person of influence, which is where you would differ from a Gateway Austin or a Mosaic or Vintage Faith in Santa Cruz. Like those churches might have a broader audience that's welcome to be part of the community than maybe a traditional church. But you're talking about a group that comes together that has leadership that isn't necessarily all on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a mixed bag. I do think that what I hear when I go to these places is I hear religious entrepreneurship. These are people who are crafting new ways of doing things. In fact, just to add another term, it's religious institutional entrepreneurship. They are creating new forms of institutional life that is reworking the logic of how they understand the Christian faith. And that is very threatening to a lot of people, but it is still what a lot of other people would recognizably see as demonstrably Christian. And there are theorists who would trace it back to the origins of Christianity itself, to say that the seeds of what we see here is still fundamentally Christian. Now, theologically, I don't answer those questions. Theologically, you have to make a lot of commitments in saying, is this what you should or shouldn't do? What I'm trying to do for you, for others, is I'm the one who's been to all these different places. And my colleague, Gladys Ganile from Northern Ireland, she knows the UK and the Ireland, Northern Ireland context much better. They have really interesting, similar dynamics. We've been able to write a transnational assessment of what this thing is. And so most people don't have the time or the energy or even the interest to spend the kind of time that we have in really investigating what's going on in these places. And you don't have to rely on speculation or opinion. We're trying to give you information that you can trust, and that it wouldn't just be what we say, but throughout the pages of the book you are hearing right from the mouths of the members and leaders of these places. And so when you go through this particular text, you'll be able to understand in a deeper way than anything you've learned before what this thing is about. It is a comprehensive assessment of the emerging church movement, even if people don't call it by that name, and even if it doesn't remain by that name in the near future. That's what we've done, a comprehensive assessment. And I've had really nice connections with other leaders. Pete Rollins has been very affirming about what we've written about him. Phyllis Tickle wrote me a personal note saying, thank you, this is the most comprehensive assessment of emergence Christianity that we have today. And so this is what I'm providing for you, is to be able to work that through carefully with conceptual language that you can use to tap into some things in deeper ways than just casual conversation or even a conference workshop will do. Then from there, then you can work, what does that mean for yourself? What does that mean for your church? What does that mean for where we're headed? Because very interesting things are happening. And we know that the moral majority was in the past, right? We're not likely to go back to that. We know that some of the really interesting innovations that happen, we're moving in new directions. This, I think, is tapping into some of those profound new directions that you may conveniently ignore and still live a happy life. But I think that we are enriched by actually paying attention to what's going on. When people are leaving our churches, or if people refuse to come to our churches, where are they going? What are they thinking? I think that this church helps people get at that.
Well, thanks for not only spending the time today, but giving us a free copy you can win at as part of my newsletter, ericbryant.org. And thanks for always challenging us. Gerardo, I'm going to put on the screen you can go to Davidson. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one here. There's actually a great website you were telling me about, academia.edu. And if you go there, you can see more about Gerardo and read what he's written. I'll put that on the screen here in just a moment. But so grateful for you, Gerardo. As always, you challenge us, and just keep up your great work. And I'll always be grateful that I was one of your interns.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate the time.
You bet. Absolutely. I'll pop this up on the screen real quick. And thanks, Gerardo, so much for everything, and enjoy the day.
All right.